Welcome everyone to this term's CSAE Development Economics webinar series. My name is Lukas Hensel. I am one of the hosts of this series and will chair this session. I'm a postdoc at the Center for the Study of African Economies. And before I introduce our first speaker for this term, let me quickly set the ground rules for the presentation today. We'll start right now. And our speaker, Sriya, will speak for 45 minutes. During this time, you may ask clarifying questions using the Q&A box. I'll monitor the chat and decide which questions to ask to Sriya throughout the presentation. If possible, please stick to clarifying questions, as we'll have 13 minutes of free Q&A after the presentation ends. During that time, you may raise your hand and if you want to ask a question, and we'll then unmute you. If you're a panelist, you can also unmute yourself then. Yeah, thanks for joining us this term again. We have a great speaker today, and we'll have many more speakers throughout the term. Hope to see you at as many seminars as possible. So today it's my great pleasure to welcome Sriya Iyer from the University of Cambridge for our first presentation. She's going to present on economic shocks and temple desecrations in medieval India, so a paper on economic history. Sriya, I will look very much forward to listening to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lucas. Let me just start to share my screen.
Great.
So let me begin just by thanking you all very much for coming and for the very kind invitation from Lucas and others and the help with Fiona and Suzanne and others with organizing this. I'm delighted to have a chance to tell you a little bit about this project of ours on economic shocks and temple desecrations in medieval India. I should emphasize that this is joint work with Anand Srivastava from Azim Premji University in Bangalore and Rohit Tikku, who is currently at Chapman University, but very soon going to be joining EUI in Florence. So for those whom I haven't met before, I'm a development economist and I have interests in demography, education, health, inequality, religion, and conflict. And for the past 15 years, I've been researching in a relatively new area of economics that's called the economics of religion. Actually, all of my work is on contemporary development, and I've been working on papers on India, Bangladesh, Kenya, Brazil, the UK, and the US. But this particular paper on the economics of religion uses historical data, and it is, a first foray for myself and Anand and Rohit into a paper in economic history. But though it's a paper in economic history, it is actually talking about three big concerns, which I think are of great relevance for contemporary development economists as well, because it links religious conflict, economic shocks, and climate change. So in today's talk, I'm going to start off first by talking a little bit about why we think weather shocks should matter for temple desecrations. I'm going to say a little bit about Indian history and religious policy by way of background, for those who may be less familiar with this particular medieval context. I'm going to discuss our data, the empirical framework, and then talk about possible mechanisms for how we think the relationship between weather shocks and temple desecrations might work, as well as look at possible alternatives. And if I'm able to get to it, say a little bit about robustness checks as well. So why should we really be interested in temple desecrations at all? We know that historically, the destruction of religious sites has been observed across cultures and across time. And whether you're looking at the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas in 2001 by the Taliban, or you're looking at the destruction of the Babri Masjid in India in 1992, or you're looking at secular regimes, the Cultural Revolution in China, the French Revolution, where there was some kind of iconoclasm, you do observe the destruction of religious sites. And many of the explanations that have been provided for these tend to be cultural or political. And so what our project is really trying to do is to suggest that economics might actually matter to this debate about temple desecrations. And so what we're doing is investigating the relationship between economic shocks and temple desecrations in medieval India. So we're looking at a period between 1192 and 1730 with a panel in 213 locations over 54 decades. Now, historians of India, notably Richard Eaton, who's one of the foremost scholars who's written about this subject, defines a temple desecration as when a temple is looted, redefined, or destroyed. So, for example, in the Indian context, you have the Indian temple of Puri that was essentially looted. What that means is that the idol, it was sacked. You have in 1635, the temple of Orcha, where the temple was completely destroyed. And then you have 1670 in Mathura, where Aurangzeb completely destroys the temple and then replaces it with a Muslim structure, replaces it with an Idgah. All of these three scenarios are regarded as a temple desecration by the historians who study this subject. And so what we're going to be arguing is that this kind of thing, religious repression, might well be a state maintenance strategy. And our work is essentially contributing to a lot of work that's been done by many economic historians, many of whom I should say are actually associated with Oxford, who have looked at weather shocks on conflict in pre-modern societies, those who've looked at religion and politics under authoritarian rule, in particular the persecution of minorities, and the literature that's looked at regime transitions. And what we're arguing here in this project is that economic shocks disrupt a political equilibrium and might lead to the destruction of religious authority. How do we actually show this? So our main result is that there is a positive relationship between weather fluctuations and the desecrations of Hindu temples under Muslim rule. And what I'm going to be showing you is empirical evidence that suggests that there is an increase in the likelihood of temple desecrations under Muslim rule during periods of large weather fluctuations. And I'll say more about what I mean by that. And the causal mechanism that we suggest is important here is that the weather shock increases the risk of rebellion, which increases the power of religious authority, which in turn might lead to religious repression by rulers. So how do we actually conceive of this process? So many economists such as Plateau, Emmanuel Auriel, Jean-Philippe Plateau, and others have been writing theoretical papers, certainly, about how religious authority might legitimize political rulers. And that's because religious authority has influence over rulers, but they also tend to have influence over the masses. In many historical societies, which typically had low levels of literacy, religious authorities were regarded as wise men upholding values of various kinds. So they tended to exert quite a lot of influence on the masses. So what we're arguing here is that in the event of an adverse weather shock, this might actually affect agricultural productivity in this medieval society, and that increases the risk of rebellion by the masses. Now, in the event of an increase in possibility of rebellion, the religious authority can either coordinate a rebellion or it can hinder a rebellion because of their influence. And so typically what you see is an increase in the power of religious authority over political rulers. And this is what the theoretical papers of Plateau and others have pointed out. However, the issue then becomes, how does the religious authority, how is it actually then dealt with by the political rulers? Now, one option, which your colleague in Oxford, Eric Cheney, has pointed out in a lovely paper on the Nile shocks, he argued that when you had these sorts of shocks, the political rulers would co-opt the religious authority to dampen the rebellion. And that is true and holds when the political rulers as well as the religious authority may belong to the same religion. What we're looking at, though, is what happens if the cost of that co-option is too high. What happens if the political authority and the religious authority don't belong to the same religion, but what happens if they belong to different religions? Then what we're arguing is that you might actually see, rather than a lot of co-option, you might actually see religious repression by rulers evident, we're arguing, in the form of temple desecrations. So for those who may be slightly less familiar with Indian medieval history in this period, I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour of Indian history under Islamic rule. My apologies to any historians who might be listening to this talk that I'm reducing 500 years of history to one slide. But essentially, what happened in India was that Islam was introduced to India in the early 8th century through trade. Islamic expansion began in the 11th century, and by the end of the 12th century, the Persian Turks established the first Muslim state in India. This Turkish slave dynasty gave way to the Mughal dynasty in the early 16th century. And for the next 2 centuries, the Mughals had an empire which exceeded in wealth and influence any contemporary state in the Islamic world. So we're talking here about a very major medieval power. Mughal power then waned in the 18th century, and that ceded space in South Asia to a host of regional powers. This included the Rajputs, the Marathas, the Sikhs, and the Jats. Now, something to note in this entire period is that temples were a great source of religious legitimacy for the Hindu rulers. And so, for example, you have the kingdom of Vijayanagar, which under the king Krishnadeva Raya built many temples, donated to them, as well as gave a lot of power to Brahmins who were running these temples. And temples performed a role in that they were important as a source of religious legitimacy, but they were also very important politically. Something to also note here is that temples actually in this period functioned in a slightly different way to mosques. Mosques in this period are religiously potent, but they are politically inactive. So when you have instances, for example, where Hindu rulers took over Muslim territories, such as when Shivaji took over the Bijapur kingdoms, or the Vijayanagar itself took over the Bahmani kingdoms, you don't actually see so many instances of mosque destruction. You actually see mosques being built because there were many Muslim soldiers in those armies. But where the temples are concerned, you do see instances of temples being destroyed, both Hindu rulers destroying other Hindu rulers' temples, as well as temple desecration with Muslim rulers sometimes destroying the Hindu temples. Now, this was largely governed in part by the religious policy of Muslim rulers. Now, the most famous of the Muslim rulers was called Akbar. He's called Akbar the Great. He's a very enlightened ruler who founds his own religion, which is a blend of Hindu and Muslim principles. But in the rulers before Akbar, they tended to rule through military strength. Their Hindu subjects paid a poll tax. This was called a jizya, and that was equivalent to about 10 days' earnings. And they also paid a pilgrimage tax, and that was to visit places of worship and to visit temples. And I'll say a bit more about the pilgrimage tax a bit later in the presentation, but it's an important source of revenue, as is the poll tax. Construction of new temples under these Mughal rulers was always forbidden, but few Muslim rulers actually engaged in any kind of persecution or the forcible conversion of Hindu subjects. And this was largely because they were governed by the Hanafi school of Islamic jurisprudence. Now, Akbar the Great, of course, abolished the poll tax, and he actually made donations at Hindu shrines. So he's one of the kings who did actually try to co-opt the religious authority. There's a wonderful example of how in the Punjab, he donates a golden umbrella to the shrine of Jwalamukhi. And this, of course, greatly is nice for the Hindus, but the Muslim ulema at the time did actually protest that Akbar was doing this. Now, his policy, of course, was pursued by his successors, his son Jahangir, and then his son Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan, for those who may not know, built the Taj Mahal. But then what happens is there's a big change in the religious policy of Muslim rulers in Indian history. With Shah Jahan's son coming to power, his name is Aurangzeb, religious tolerance essentially vanishes. There is an edict in 1659 that bans Hindu temple construction. Aurangzeb reimposes the poll tax on Hindus in 1679, and he actually provides explicit orders to provincial governors to destroy Hindu temples and schools. This is an example of one of the temples that was repeatedly desecrated and rebuilt. It's the Somnath temple in Gujarat. And for those of you who may be followers of British detective stories, if you've ever read Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone, you will remember that the Moonstone is actually not a moonstone, but a diamond. That diamond was supposed to have been taken on one of those temple desecration visits from the head of this particular god in this particular temple, the Somnath temple, right way back in 1024. So in our data, we're looking at temple desecrations under Muslim rule, and we use and record 80 events of temple desecration that occurred between 1192 and 1730 that are established with historical certainty. And we're using Eaton's data in this respect. Now, Richard Eaton wrote a very important paper, which was published in the Journal of Islamic Studies, published by your Oxford Institute of Islamic Studies, where he recorded these 80 events of temple desecration. Now, 80 might seem like quite a small number to you, and it is. You know, when you're reading the current political narrative in India about temple desecrations, numbers such as 60,000 and 120,000 are frequently thrown around. If you actually look at the number of events that are recorded with historical certainty, we can locate 80 in this period. So in our sample, the probability of temple desecrations in all periods is 0.7%. This is a rare event. Temples in general, as I said, are treated as state property. They're generally protected and they're maintained, but this is broken in periods of social turmoil and agrarian distress. So between 1660 and 1670, following a severe period of drought, Aurangzeb orders the destruction, for example, of the Keshavdeva temple in Mathura. This table actually shows you the pattern of temple desecrations according to 3 phases of Mughal rule across this period. If you're interested in who exactly was conducting these desecrations, sometimes it's the crown prince, sometimes it's the emperor, sometimes it's the governor or the nawab or the military commander. One thing I should point out is that there are 2 Muslim rulers who actually stand out in terms of, you know, being quite iconoclastic in that they were responsible for many desecrations. One is Aurangzeb, who I've already spoken about, and the other is Sultan Sikandar of Kashmir. And they are, and it is important to point out, especially when I'm presenting some of the other results, we present the results with and without these iconoclastic rulers. So what we are doing is compiling a unique georeference data set on medieval India, which is spanning 5 centuries. It includes data on medieval temple locations, desecrations, polities, battles, and weather fluctuations. And we're beginning with the survey of the temple desecrations compiled by Richard Eaton. So Eaton identifies 80 temple locations that observed a desecration, the location, and this has information on the location, the year, as well as the perpetrator. And in some ways, these 80 temple desecrations, I would think, are a lower bound on the number of desecrations that occur. But we stick to these 80 because we have strictly contemporary epigraphic and literary evidence that they did actually occur. And that evidence comes from the writings of scholars like Amir Khusro and Amir Hassan and others who wrote at the time. Sometimes we can't actually take some desecrations that were recorded later in the colonial period, and maybe we can talk about that in the discussion, mainly because it is not always clear to colonial historians that those are actually true of the events that occurred in the medieval period. So we've stuck to the strictly contemporary epigraphic and literary evidence that you have, and from that, you know, you've got the 80 temple desecrations. What Eaton didn't have was the temple locations that were not desecrated. And so that's where we come in. So our team essentially created a universe of medieval temple locations from the Atlas of Medieval India. We went through a matching process, matching medieval maps. And in the process, we were basically able to identify 213 different religious sites. So the key figures to remember is that there are 213 different religious sites, 18 temple desecrations over a period of 54 decades. This is a picture. The red dots here are showing you the temple locations that were desecrated. The blue dots are essentially showing you the temple locations that were not desecrated. Somnath, the temple that I showed you, is in this corner of Gujarat over here. So in addition to the data on the desecrations, we're also trying to identify political dynasties and their territorial rule from the Atlas of Medieval India. And we are able to identify for this period 60 polities that are identified for medieval India. So we can then identify the polity where a temple was actually located in a given decade. Our sample, therefore, ends up with 7,678 observations where we can actually match the religious sites to the polities. Now, in 30% of the cases, so these are the ones we can match, so that's about 70% of the cases. In 30% of the cases, we can't match the religious site to the polity. And the reason for that is because some temples are located in caves or mountains, which means that they are very remote, so they don't fall under a polity. In other cases, polities are very small, so they don't come under the atlas and the the polities that are established. And in so because of some of these reasons, we in the results that I'm going to present, I'm only going to confine myself to the religious sites where we are able to match the polities. We also do the analysis with another matching strategy for the ones where we don't, but I can talk about that when we talk about robustness. We've also collected data on the religion of the state, the capital location, the tenure of the ruler, and the year in which the polity collapsed. Now, in order to, because our main thesis is about looking at weather shocks and temple desecrations, we collect data on temperature fluctuations, which has been compiled by geologists and climatologists. Mann et al. Have presented this data, and many economic historians have used this for various studies across the world. And it essentially uses a climate field reconstruction approach. So you have data from paleoclimatic studies, which are calculating historical temperatures from tree rings, marine core, ice core, sediment, and other long instrumental records over 1,500 years. And what the Mann et al. Data are showing you are average annual temperature for 5-degree latitude by 5-degree longitude grids yearly from 500 to 1959. And the historical temperature data are reported as deviations measured in degrees Celsius from 1961 to the 1990 mean temperature. Using GIS, we then match the yearly temperature data for each temple location, and then we take the decadal deviation average. One of the reasons why we're doing this at the decade level is because, as many other scholars who've used these data have also pointed out, the temperature data are not as good at finer frequencies as they are at the decade level. Now, you might be worried that the temperature values interpolated here is from a limited set of proxies, and so you might have spatial correlation between the values. And so in this project, what we also do is to use a second data set that reconstructs summer precipitation in Asia from the data provided by Shi et al. And this uses, again, tree ring proxies and historical documentary records to create rainfall estimates annually from 1430 to 1920 at a smaller degree grid resolution. These data are testing if the baseline findings are robust to using an alternative climate proxy at a finer resolution. But because this is only 300 years in our sample rather than the whole time period, I'm mainly going to be reporting the results for the entire time period. But our paper reports both the temperature data as well as the precipitation data. We allow for spatial clustering and serial correlation in the standard errors, with the radius varying from 200 kilometers to 1,500 kilometers along the line suggested by Colella and others in their recent working paper. And again, using GIS, we're matching the precipitation data for each temple location and taking the decadal average. Let me quickly go through our empirical framework. Our main dependent variable is temple desecrations. That's a dummy which equals 1 if a desecration is recorded at a temple location I in polity K in period T. M is Muslim rule. That's a dummy which equals 1 if the temple location I was under Muslim rule in period T. We've got temperature deviation. So our temperature is variable is a dummy which equals 1 if the temperature deviation recorded in period T was either in the top or the bottom quartile of temple location I's sample. What that actually means is that you're looking at the temperature in a particular location in a decade relative to the temperature across the entire period of study. The main variable of interest, of course, is beta 3. That's looking at the probability of temple desecration under Muslim rule in a period of a large weather shock. We have a series of controls in our model. I should say we're using a linear probability model because, as I said earlier, temple desecrations are a rare event, and the linear probability model, its properties are invariant to the rare event bias compared to, say, other forms of estimation. We've got a whole bunch of controls. So distance of the temple location I to the capital of the polity, on the assumption that perhaps if a temple was more remote, it was less likely to be desecrated. We have controls for the Muslim dynasty length, whether the duration of the Muslim polity K had been in power in a particular period T. And then we have a whole series of fixed effects. We have location fixed effects. So that's looking at, for example, if the temple was proximate to a medieval port, on the assumption that ports might be wealthier than other places. Somnath, for example, the temple that I showed you, is actually located in a very famous Gujarat port. We have period fixed effects. because there may be broader changes in military or agricultural technologies that you observe over time. And of course, dynastic fixed effects. As I mentioned, there may be unobserved polity characteristics, which is the type of Islamic jurisprudence. One thing we know is that many of the Mughal rulers followed the Hanafi school, which suggested a conciliatory attitude towards religious minorities. And then you also have certain, Sunni jurisprudence restrictions, which also suggest, a conciliatory attitude rather than a very aggressive attitude towards minorities. This is just a simple picture that shows you the temple desecrations in green across the decades and the MAN data on the temperature deviations. So this is essentially historical temperature data in degrees Celsius reported in deviations from the mean. And one point that I should make is that the decade average means essentially shown here are below zero. What that actually means is that the period of study that we're looking at, that essentially the 1200 to the 1800s, is a cooler time period than what we're experiencing now in the modern period. So let me show you the baseline results. Essentially, what they're showing is that the likelihood of temple desecrations under Muslim rule during a weather shock increases by 0.4 percentage points relative to a sample average of 0.65. One of the things we also wanted to do is to first exclude the iconoclastic rulers. So I mentioned earlier that we had Aurangzeb and Sikandar, both of whom were, thought of as iconoclasts. They account for between them about 13 of the desecrations in the sample. So we present the baseline results both with, the iconoclastic rulers included, as well as, without the iconoclastic rulers. We lose about 402 observations when we remove the iconoclastic rulers, but I think it's more precisely estimated at that point. So our story here, how do we actually explain these desecrations, is very much revolving around weather shocks and agricultural productivity and regime characteristics, but there are various alternatives as well. So I'll take you through first our story and then talk about some of the other potential alternatives. So we're arguing that weather shocks decrease agricultural productivity, which increases the risk of rebellion, and this increases religious repression. Now, there are other studies that suggest that better soil quality reduces the negative effect of weather fluctuations on agricultural productivity. Now, because we don't have the actual soil quality for that medieval period at each of those temple locations, what we do is to use current NASA Earth observing systems data on gridded soil characteristics, which have a spatial resolution of 10 by 10 kilometers. And we measure soil quality through higher nitrogen density as well as carbon content to try to construct the average nitrogen and carbon density levels for those temple locations. The reason we feel we can do this is that even if this is measured with error, when we're looking at the broad span of climate changes and soil changes and so forth, what we're trying to establish is whether there are variations across the country in terms of whether the Gangetic Plain is different, say, to the Deccan Plateau. For those purposes, it is fine to use the soil quality data that we have, even if it's contemporary, although, of course, ideally, we would have wanted to get this data for the medieval period itself. But what we do find, even if we use this with measurement error, is that the locations with better soil quality are less likely to experience temple desecrations under Muslim rule during adverse shocks. And you can see that with on the triple interaction term here, when we're using the measure of nitrogen density and when we're using the measure of carbon density. Now, one of the theses that we're promoting in this project is that in some ways, this agricultural productivity is linked to rebellions, and that is actually causing these desecrations. And of course, for this particular period, which is the medieval period, there is no systematic data on rebellions in medieval India. Ideally, what we would have wanted all the rebellions and all the agricultural productivity estimates for that period. So what we do is, within the paper, we do a case analysis using the data that is available, which is essentially one study by Rana, who has village-level records of rebellions across Parganas and Mughal provinces of Ajmer and Agra. We create a cross-sectional data set of rural rebellions for 66 Parganas, and then we match the Parganas to our proxies for weather fluctuations and soil quality, this time using the precipitation data, which has enough cross-sectional variation at that Pargana level. We're looking obviously at a much more limited period than our entire period. It's just 1670 to 1730, for which we have the precipitation level for Pargana I, and we look at whether it was in the top or bottom quartile of its precipitation sample. And then we test whether having more decades of these weather fluctuations increase the rebellion duration and whether this effect is mediated by soil quality. And I'm not showing you that table, it is in the paper, but the bottom line result was that controlling for soil quality, an additional decade of large weather fluctuations increases rebellion duration for this sample by approximately 3 years. Now, in this period, 1670 to 1730, the average sample average for the rebellions is about 38. So it's a period of actually pretty intense rebellion as well. The effect of the weather shocks on total rebellion duration is then dampened in those parganas with higher soil quality. So we present this as evidence that the soil quality does seem to matter for this. Now, in addition to that, there may be other things you're thinking of that would affect temple desecrations. And one of those is regime characteristics. It could be that Muslim dynasties who were in power for longer were less likely to experience rebellions and revolutions, partly because, as Moreland, who's a historian of India, has commented, older dynasties tend to have a stronger military force, and they may also have a better fiscal system to absorb the negative shocks of negative consequences of agrarian shocks. So they could give you tax concessions if you had a crop failure, for example. So one of the things that we're also looking at in this project is dynasty length as a proxy for state capacity. Weather shocks and longer dynasty length, did it lead to decreased threat of rebellion and lower religious repression? The other factor that might matter is that not just how long the dynasty was in existence, but the tenure of specific rulers. Now, the Indo-Muslim rulers were particularly susceptible to rebellion at the onset of their tenure because there was no fixed rule of succession. And so the most famous story associated with this is Aurangzeb. Again, he was one of 4 brothers. Shah Jahan, his father, had decreed that Dara Shikoh, the eldest son, would become the next emperor. Aurangzeb essentially murdered his elder brother Dara, as well as 2 other brothers, put his father in prison and came to power. Now, this is the most dramatic of the stories, but many of the Indo-Muslim rulers did face assassination threats in the first 5 years or so of their reign. So one of the things that we also tried to assemble as a part of this project is the cause of death for these Muslim rulers. We were able to find that with certainty for only 95 out of the 166 Muslim rulers. But looking at that data, again, there's a table in the paper. If you're interested to look at it more closely, it shows a robust negative relationship between assassination probability and ruler tenure. So what we also wanted to look at was whether weather shocks with longer ruler tenure essentially decreases the threat of rebellion and decreases religious repression. And that's exactly what we found in the data. If you're from an older Muslim dynasty in power for longer, you are less likely to desecrate temples during adverse weather shocks, as indeed are rulers who had longer tenure. Now, our story is about weather shocks, productivity, and regime characteristics. But in this narrative, both the historical narrative as well as the current political narrative in India, where they've been talking about this temple desecration issue, there are many alternative explanations that one also needs to think about. Now, one could be scapegoating. One could be that these temples were being looted, or that they were simply acting as collateral damage. Now, the scapegoating theory is actually very common when you're looking at work by Johnson and Koyama and others, where they were looking at medieval European populations from 1100 to 1800. Scapegoating was very often an explanation that has been provided by economists to talk about, for example, Jewish persecution in the medieval period. In the Indian case, we can't go with the scapegoating explanation. And that's because the Muslim rulers were actually ruling over a Hindu majority population. In 1600, Muslims were only 10 to 11% of the population. That number stayed more or less the same under British rule. Today, Muslims are about 15% of the population. So scapegoating is not the reason why these desecrations were happening. We also show in the paper that Muslim states were no more likely to desecrate wealthier temples under their rule, so they were not plundering the Hindu temples for their wealth in response to a shock to tax revenues, and the weather fluctuations did not increase the intensity of Hindu-Muslim battles and collateral damage in the temple desecrations. How do we show this? Well, we know that the temples were great repositories of great wealth. And Irfan Habib, in his account of the sacking of the Somnath temple, which I showed you, says, when Muhammad of Ghazni sacked this temple, not 100 part of the gold and precious stones he obtained were found in the treasury of any king of Hindustan. Now, it could be that agrarian shocks increased the economic incentives for looting temples. And one question that always struck us when, as economists, we were looking at this problem was that the Muslim rulers actually benefited by controlling the pilgrimage economy by charging a pilgrimage tax. So we couldn't understand why looting would be a reason to destroy a temple. Why would they actually destroy an asset that was going to then give them lots of returns in the future? It didn't seem sort of rational to us. So what we then started looking at is we started looking into this pilgrimage tax, and we looked at pilgrimage networks as a proxy for the wealth of religious sites. Using these pilgrimage networks, again, there's not a lot of data in this period. One of the few studies that does try to look at pilgrimage networks is composed from a big Indian epic that's called the Mahabharata. It has a particular section in it called the Tirthyatra section. Tirthyatra is pilgrimage. And this was composed between the 3rd century BC and the 3rd century CE. And Bhardwaj, in his book, reconstructed pilgrimages routes and listed 24 important places of pilgrimage. We were able to match 20 out of those original 24 to our data set. And because our data set is a millennium later, it suggests the importance of these sites. We create a dummy that equals 1 if a religious site is an important pilgrimage center according to the Mahabharata. We think that pilgrimage centers would be wealthier due to pilgrimage activity. And a looting kind of explanation would suggest that they are more likely to have temple desecration under Muslim rule during an adverse weather shock. So what we do is we interact the pilgrimage site dummy with the main effect, but the main effect is robust to including the triple interaction. And so what we're suggesting is that looting may not actually be the main channel that's driving temple desecrations under Muslim rule. Something I should also mention here, and again, maybe we can keep this for the discussion, is that this pilgrimage tax, it was imposed by the Mughals, but it was actually retained by the British because it was so lucrative right up until 1840. So we do feel that this should be part of the story, and might not necessarily be a looting explanation which tends to sort of drive the political narrative on this question. Now, one other possibility is that the desecrations were just happening because of collateral damage, that you have weather shocks that affect the frequency of battles, and Nathan Nunn and others have written quite a lot about this. You could have a decline in agricultural productivity that increases competition over land. Lower agricultural wages can raise the labor supply for military recruitment. Rising food prices could raise the cost of maintaining a standing army. And therefore, if there was a battle between Hindus and Muslims, the temples are simply collateral damage. To investigate this, we collected data on battles and their participants from the Dictionary of Battles and Sieges. Now, that's an international source of 8,500 battles, and we cross-checked the Indian battles that were there with a local Indian source, which is Narvane, who looked at battles in medieval India between 15th and 18th centuries. And if they appeared in both sources, we then used them in our project. And through this process, we could identify 223 battles, 60% of which involved at least one Muslim polity as a participant. And we then look at the interaction between a number of Hindu-Muslim battles which occurred within a 200-kilometer radius of temple location I in period T, and the weather fluctuation dummy. As you can see here, there's no evidence that weather shocks affect temple desecrations by increasing the intensity of these Hindu-Muslim battles. Now, it could be that it's not just about having the battle, but who actually wins in the battle. And this is the intuition which the historian Richard Eaton has suggested might be something to consider. He suggested in his famous paper that temple desecrations occurred when Muslim states expanded into Hindu states through battle victories. And his intuition was that royal temples are a legitimizing agent for the Hindu kingship. Invading a Muslim state delegitimizes the political authority of the Hindu ruler. And so we thought it was important to test this Eaton hypothesis in our data set. So we control for the number of battles won by a Muslim state against a Hindu state within a 200-kilometer radius of temple location I in period T. And what we find is that the Muslim state was actually much more likely to desecrate a new Hindu temple in a new territory when the likelihood of upheaval was actually very high due to the weather fluctuations. And you can actually see this more clearly in this table. table. I think one thing that is very striking when you're looking at, say, at this line here is the size of the effect. The size of the effect essentially here of a weather fluctuation in a territory that was newly conquered essentially by this battle. It's 4 times the effect as what would be the effect of a kingdom that temple that was already under Muslim rule. And so one of the things that this kind of suggested to us was that perhaps the states are simply more sensitive to unrest in newly conquered territories. So they would desecrate the temples when they moved into newly conquered territories rather than actually attacking the temples or desecrating the temples that were already for a long time in their existing within their existing polity. I'm conscious that I have sort of 5 minutes left. So what we also do, just to clarify, is a series of robustness checks on some of these results. We deal with spatial and serial correlation because, as I pointed out, the temperature variation can be spatially correlated, and we're using a radius between 200 kilometers and 1,500 kilometers. We're assuming serial correlation decays by 100 years. And so we can use the Colella arbitrary clustering strategy as well. One of the things that might have struck you when I was presenting the results is that we are assuming that the hotter periods and colder periods are going to actually have the same effect on agricultural productivity. So you could have positive shocks and negative shocks. So in our robustness checks, we do look into that, and what we find is that the hotter periods tend to have the more desecrations. Again, as I said, I'm not going to show you all of these tables in detail. They're all in the paper for you to pore over if you're interested to look at this. One of the other things we also did in our robustness checks was to look at alternative definitions of weather fluctuations. Now, our temperature deviation variable is looking at the top quartile and the bottom quartile when we're looking at the temperature deviation, but that is actually an arbitrary choice. So what we do is also look at the top 20 percentile and the bottom 20, top 30, bottom 30, top 35, bottom 35, and so forth, just to make sure the results are robust to the definition of the weather fluctuation. Let me talk a little bit about the assignment of the dynasties. So I'd mentioned that in the results that I presented, we are only presenting the results where we could match the religious sites to the polities. Now, in the cases of those sites which we could not match because they were located in a cave or the polity is not known or is too small, what we did do as a robustness check is to assign the nearest polity to that particular site. And that increases our observations from 7,678 to 11,502. And of course, that doesn't change the results at all. But that is something that we did. It's partly a result of the fact why we have to always use the more limited sample is partly a result of the fact that we're using these medieval maps, 12 to 15 of them, and mapping them to modern India. And sometimes those maps don't always fit perfectly. Any temple that was desecrated in a period before the period that we're looking at are not in the maps. So clearly, we exclude the temples that are not in any previous period, which we don't have an account for. And then we also look at the lagged effect of weather fluctuation. So it could be that if a particular temple has experienced successive periods of, very strong weather shocks, maybe the Muslim ruler in that area might have behaved differently. That's something that you might want to look at as well. Anyway, that's something that we look at too. Just to conclude, what our paper is doing is it's looking at the relationship between authoritarian rule and religious authority in a period of economic downturns. And what our project is really trying to do is, for a period of Indian history where you don't actually have very many economic or indeed historical studies of this period, because most of the work in India tends to focus on the colonial period, we have tried to compile a new data set of Hindu-Muslim temple desecrations under Muslim rule. And we are suggesting that there may have been heightened religious repression under Muslim rule in periods of large weather fluctuations. What we're trying to do really is to suggest that state maintenance was the likely explanation, and that economics has something to say to these particular debates. Now, one thing I should also mention is we're not dismissing in any way ideas that have been put forward by other scholars that some of the desecrations may have occurred purely on the basis of ideology. We cannot dismiss that. It is very possible some of the desecrations occurred on ideology alone. But we do feel that, in addition to some of these cultural and political explanations, you might want to look at some of the economic characteristics of these times as well. The reason we feel that doing this project as a development economist is actually probably quite important to do is that if you actually look at the current, narrative, certainly among certain quarters in South Asia that talk about temple desecrations, many of you will know that the Babri Masjid, for example, was demolished in 1992. Last year, the Indian Supreme Court passed a ruling that, that site belongs to the Hindus, and they're now building a new temple to the Hindu god Ram on that, previously disputed site. And at the time when the Babri Masjid was demolished, it caused very severe Hindu-Muslim riots in India. So one of the reasons as a development economist or as an economist of religion that we are interested in actually looking at this issue is because it does address, in some ways, current public policy concerns. One of the things that we're showing is that the number of temple desecrations were not in the hundreds of thousands, but were actually probably much smaller. The Mughal rulers in large part were probably far more benign. We're arguing maybe because of the pilgrimage tax than might have been suggested. And, we do feel that it is important for economists to weigh into this debate a little bit, at least, by looking at the data and looking at the evidence of this period, perhaps because we are going to be able to contribute to this ongoing narrative as well. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm delighted to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much for this presentation, Sriya. Yes, so now we are at the Q&A part of the seminar. So if anyone has a question, feel free to either use the raise hand button in Zoom, or if you're on the panel, you can unmute yourself.
Lucas, would you like me to stop sharing my screen?
You can continue. You might want to go back and forth on the slides, so I think that might be quite useful.
So can I go? I have a question.
Yes, please.
Hi, Sriya. This is super interesting. So I just have a question regarding the underlying theory, kind of maybe some ideas or thoughts of how you could maybe get at this in more detail. So as I understand it, right, so as you kind of said when you talked about the different mechanisms, Hindus are the majority here. And it seems like they're the group that the rulers are worried about. And it's not clear to me from a theoretical standpoint why destroying this group's kind of temples is the optimal strategy. I mean, maybe it's intimidation. There's a bunch of stories you could kind of come up with. But I was kind of curious about what Hindu rulers did before the Muslim conquest of these areas. What was their strategy to deal with these shocks? And kind of relatedly, I think it might be interesting to just look even at just the first differences. That is, you probably have already done this, and maybe you had this in the slides and I just missed it. Just kind of limiting it to Muslim rule, because kind of the comparison with the Hindu period, I wouldn't think that they would want to destroy their own temples. Again, I might have missed that because maybe you've already addressed that concern. Maybe I was misunderstanding the tables, but I just wanted to raise that. And it kind of was a related kind of point, as almost a corollary. I was curious if you could do something with the time these areas had been under Muslim rule. I think you do it a little bit with the conquest, but I think there's a large amount of variation in what historically kind of, I mean, you can think of Sindh and these areas that were incorporated very, very early. And you might be able to do something with this, even if you don't have share Muslim, because it might help you get at some of these questions of the mechanism.
Thank you so much, Eric, for your question. First off, let me just say that this project was very inspired by your own work on Egypt. So thank you so much for these thoughts and observations. So on the first point about the what the Hindu rulers were doing. So there is evidence, and Eaton's work actually does record this. Our data set is, of course, just looking at Muslim rulers that were desecrating the Hindu Hindu temples. And so we don't actually have a data set in quite the same way for what was going on before even this period that we're looking at, so before the 1192. But what we do know from certain records and from the history that I've read on that period is that the Hindu rulers also used a temple desecration with other Hindu rulers. So you have examples, for example, in the 10th century of the Rashtrakutas actually doing this with one of their rivals at the time. And that's because, as I was mentioning earlier, the temples actually had very strong political significance. And so sacking the temple of the ruler of the opposing Hindu kingdom and taking the idol away to your kingdom was definitely a strategy that some of the Hindu rulers did use as well. You know, I had talked about more the issue about why they didn't do that to the mosques, but there is evidence of Hindu rulers actually attacking other Hindu rulers in various periods. It's just that we don't have a systematic database that actually looks at those. This might actually be a very nice project for us to do, having done the medieval period, to now go back even further and to look at the, you know, the Hindu period before then. On the Sindh and looking at the specific areas, absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. You know, this is really, you know, my first sort of foray into economic history and the first kind of work that we're doing in this. I certainly think that looking at the more localized studies in particular areas, like we did with the case analysis of Ajmer and the Bharadwaj data, can certainly be done for you know, smaller areas such as Sindh. I hope that we will have the opportunity to be able to do that going forward.
Can I jump in, Lucas?
Please do.
Yes, hi, thank you so much. This is absolutely fascinating. I have a question about your sample, which is also related to my ignorance about Indian history and economic history. 80 episodes that don't sound like many, but also 200 temples don't sound like that many for such a big subcontinent, basically. So I was wondering whether you should think about this as the population of the religious buildings in this period in India, or whether this is just the most important ones. And related to that, whether we should think that the story would be different if we include smaller cult sites of any type, and also whether this, if these are actually larger temples that are a bit like special somehow, whether you have looked into their economic function. So whether they, for instance, own you know, large amounts of land, whether they operated as administrative units for the government, and whether this plays into your story.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Is it Mattia? Mattia. Thank you
yes,
very much.
Brilliant pronunciation.
Thank you very much. So in terms of the sample, yes. So we've actually been quite strict with the sample in that we chose, you know, we've got the temples that have the current contemporary epigraphic and literary sources that are corroborating that those desecrations actually occurred. Now, there's no doubt that the number of desecrations that did occur, or the number of temples, are probably much more. These are the ones that are verifiable. Now, the reason that we went for this strategy, I should also explain, is that there's actually a big historical debate in the historical literature on South Asia about how after this medieval period, you have the British colonial period. And a lot of the history of India in that colonial period, where this temple desecration issue is concerned, sometimes writes about temple desecrations that we don't know whether they actually occurred or not. And it was partly because certain books that were very prominent in the historicity of that time were trying to portray the British as just and efficient compared to the Mughal rulers who had come before them. I'm thinking especially about Henry Eliot's book on in 1849, for example, where there has been a lot of discussion about by historians about the you know, whether we can actually rely on the descriptions of the temple desecrations and so forth in those books. We don't know whether they actually happened in the medieval period or not. So that's one of the reasons why our sample is small. It is 80 instances, because these are the ones that we actually have contemporary accounts of people saying they went into the next room, they went into the sanctum, they, you know, and we've actually got those verified. So that's one. One issue. I'm fairly certain that if you looked at, we're after all looking at temples in many cases that have survived for the entire 500-year period. So it doesn't include the smaller temples and so forth. I think it would be very interesting if we are able to get data on the smaller temples for this particular period to see whether our results would hold even otherwise. One thing I can say though is when we were investigating the pilgrimage tax and some of the issues around that, you were asking whether they owned land and so forth. Some of these temples were extremely wealthy. So just to give you an idea, there is no account of what the pilgrimage tax was charged in the medieval period, but in the colonial accounts of the temples, we know that they charged, for example, some of the big temples, 2 rupees per person to join. And in the period 1830 to 1840, one of the biggest temples in India called Tirupati earned about, this we are absolutely sure, earned about 120,000 rupees based on that. The Puri Jagannath in the north for the period 1830 to 1840 earned about 900,000 rupees. So clearly from the pilgrimage tax alone, they were actually earning quite a lot of revenue, which was then going into the maintenance of these temples. So they did actually support their local economy in various ways, as they do even now. So this is an economic history paper, but actually a lot of my book on the economics of religion in India talks about contemporary temples in India and all the public goods works they're doing and the various lands and things that they own. Many of those temples, which equally feature in this sample, were definitely prominent members of the local economy. One other, piece of evidence I think we can cite that these were actually probably quite significant temples is that when the British came to power after the Mughals, they actually did not abolish the pilgrimage tax until 1840. That's 100 years after our particular sample period. And the only reason they did it is because there was pressure amongst English evangelicals saying they should not sanction superstition in India. And that is when in 1840, because of pressure from Britain, the pilgrimage tax was finally removed. So my sense is that these pilgrimage sites and these temples in particular were wealthy, are wealthy, and do certainly, in the modern day, they have hospitals and educational institutions and other things. In that period, they would most certainly have been owning a lot of land, cattle. In some of the work, for example, that I've done on contemporary India, we have temples that own 900 cows as a way of dealing with risk and insurance needs in certain parts of Gujarat. So I'm fairly certain that in that period as well, I would not be surprised if they were not, equally influential.
Great, thank you. We have time for one last question. Julien is raising his hand.
Thanks, Sriya. Thanks, Lucas. Thanks, Sriya. It was really, really interesting. I have kind of one question which might stem from Magnons and maybe a suggestion. So the first thing is, when you talk about location, like, is it like the location of the polity where the temple is positioned, or is it just the specific position of the temple? Because I might think that, like, as a ruler, maybe I want, the shock is only going to have an effect very, very locally. But if I'm thinking about looting, maybe what matters is kind of the overall shock for the polity, and I need resources. And so you might be able to play with how you define location on also the shock to be able to kind of distinguish between your theories a bit more precisely. And the other thing, while you were presenting, I remember that James Fensky was presenting at the CSAE conference a couple of months ago, and they have this paper on the kind of the introduction of new crops in India around the 1500. And basically, it seems like the effect of the weather shocks was different with those new crops. And so maybe it would be interesting for you also to compare those different time periods, because you might have the same kind of weather shock, but the effect on productivity might be different. And so you should observe kind of, might be an additional source of variation for you to take advantage of.
Thank you so much, Julian. These are wonderful ideas for our project, and I'll definitely look at the Fensky work. In terms of the location, so by location, we mean the exact, we have both the exact temple location, and we looked separately at where that location was in which polity. That's in terms of the location data. But certainly, we can explore these issues very much more. I am aware aware that James has been doing quite a lot with the man data as well, and that's been used in other contexts too. But I will certainly explore this data on the different types of crops. I think one of the things that did strike me with this project is that even compared to contemporary development work, we're literally sort of piecing together like a jigsaw puzzle what was going on in a very, very long time ago. So any help we can get in terms of being able to refine the analysis is very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sriya, once again. Yeah, it was a great presentation. Before I let everyone go, let me briefly remind you of next week's webinar. Jonas Short from the Columbia Business School will present on information barriers to market access, experimental evidence from Liberian firms. Importantly, next week, the seminar will be at 4 p.m. UK time and not at 1 p.m. due to the speaker's location. Yeah, thank you again very much. I hope to see you again and all the attendees and listeners as well.